A little while ago, I made a video about anti-intellectualism in book talk and how there's this idea that the type of books that book talk is making famous right now is promoting this idea of anti-intellectualism within the reading community because these books are not intellectual enough for us to critically engage with. Since that video, there has been a lot about anti-intellectualism that has stuck with me, since there was quite a bit of research that went into putting that script together. So I feel like I really wanted to make another video so I could dive more into the actual concept of intellectualism versus anti-intellectualism a little more, and how I feel they're understood in the community right now, especially the online community, where this idea of intellectualism is kind of picking up and becoming a really commonly used term. So what I really want to focus on today is understanding the concept of anti-intellectualism and what people are saying we should do to combat anti-intellectualism. So what are people saying is the cure for this supposed anti-intellectual crisis? And I want to be able to do that to understand both of these ideologies a little bit better. I think one of the things I've been struggling with, one, when I did my research previously, but also because I did that research, I keep getting videos on it. I also wanted to understand how people actually define these terms, because in a lot of these videos, people aren't actually defining what they mean when they say, oh, this is 5 things you can do to be more intellectual, or, oh my god, like book talk is so anti-intellectual right now. People aren't actually describing what they mean when they say these words. And so I'm really hoping to use some of that information that I have from my research, some other things that I've heard since then, and try to piece together this concept of anti-intellectualism or intellectualism. And if you did watch my previous video, you would know that one of the main outcomes, or one of the main takeaways that I had at the end of that video, was I really don't agree with using the terms intellectualism and anti-intellectualism to describe what's happening right now in book talk. And if you haven't watched the video, you can check it out. I'll link everything in the description, and I'll add a little card up here too if you want to click on that video. But my biggest issue was I truly felt that what we were seeing right now in terms of, the types of books that people are saying are making book talk famous, and a lot of times you'll hear the usual culprits. You'll hear A Court of Thorns and Roses, and you'll hear Fourth Wing, or any Colleen Hoover book. I absolutely think those are bad books, in my opinion, and I will say that I think they're bad in my opinion, but I don't believe that anti-intellectualism is the word to capture what's happening right now. And that's what I've doubled down on since my previous video as well. I think my previous video I was a little bit, I don't know, I could be on any side of this fence. But I think in this video I've taken a pretty strong stance here, and I'm totally doubling down on I do not think that these are the right words to use to describe what's happening right now. And you will see that, or I hope I'm gonna make that clear as to why I think that over the course of this video. I will say a major change for me was as I learned more about intellectualism from different points of views and different communities, I feel like I was able to double down not only on I don't think that anti-intellectualism is the right term, but I don't think that intellectualism is what we should be promoting, in a sense of I don't think that we should be telling people that, oh, you can be an intellectual too. I know that sounds anti-intellectual, but I'll go over all of it. My initial thought and my initial reaction coming into this, and what you'll kind of see over the course of the video, is I do feel like we have co-opted the term anti-intellectualism online specifically. And by online, I mean things like TikTok communities, things like book talk, where people are creating a very specific niche of content where you're talking about how to be more intellectual. And this can be either in videos that are just titled How to Be More Intellectual, but videos that also talk about, how to take back your education, how to take control of your mind, how to be intelligent, how to be hot, smart, and intellectual, how to be disgustingly well-read or disgustingly educated. People are making content about how regular people can be intellectuals, and how you can do this for free, how you can do it in, 15 minutes a day, how you can do it even though you've never gone to university or college, or how you can be an academic outside of an academic institution. I'm talking about all these types of content that has been coming out a little bit more recently over the past 1 or 2 years, where it's really taken off online to create content and to create influencer content on how to be more intellectual. That's what I'm talking about. What I want to stress here is that when we're using this almost incorrect definition of anti-intellectualism, or we're using this co-opted version of anti-intellectualism and we're pitting it against this now so-called idea of intellectualism, it just kind of makes for a pretty absurd conversation in general. Like, I think that when we're pitting an idea that isn't accurate against an idea that we've made up to fill the gaps of what we're saying it is to be anti-intellectual, I think it's kind of wild, right? We're saying that being anti-intellectual is so and so and so and so, and being intellectual is the opposite of it, but we haven't actually based anti-intellectualism in the root of anti-intellectualism. That's what I thought was interesting. But like I said, I really wanted to see what is it people are saying you should do to be intellectual, because I feel like if we're saying that, you know, hey, this is what you can do to be intellectual, we can kind of reverse engineer it and say, well, I guess this is what it means to be anti-intellectual. So before I go off on another tangent, let's look at that first. I had gone through a few videos and I'd gone through a few articles and tried to put together this list of what it is to be an intellectual. There was quite a bit of information, I will say. Each of these videos were a little bit different, but I tried to grab some of the overall themes of what they were saying and put that together to make this pretty high level list of this is the ideas behind being an intellectual. So we had read books. Okay, this was everywhere. This was always the first point too. So you have to read, guys. You cannot be illiterate. So you have to read more books. I will say I was a little bit confused on what counted as good books to read, because there were some people who said it didn't matter, you know, what types of books you read, you have to engage with it. And I was like, okay, that's very vague. But there were also some people who were like, well, you need to read as widely as possible. Like, you need to learn as much information as you can, and you need to read as widely as possible. And some people were saying it's not about reading widely, it's about reading deeply. So instead of trying to read everything from every genre or from every, you know, subject, focus in on one or two, like hone your reading and what you're learning and that kind of stuff. So kind of have some conflicting concepts there. For the next point we had was journal. Now this was interesting too, because people weren't just talking about journaling as in, you know, dear diary, today I went to the store, hee hee. It wasn't like journaling, it was almost reflective journaling. So every time people talked about journaling, they talked about it in relation to the books that they were reading. So they were like, you need to journal, and you need to journal about what you learned. So when you read a book, sit and take some time to reflect and journal about it. And I was like, okay, so keep like a book journal specifically. Like, it can't just be any journal. So that was interesting too. Learn, you have to learn. That was something that was brought up many times, which is really interesting to me, because I feel like the concept of an intellectual already tells you that they're learning. But anyways, here they stressed on, you know, keeping your mind open to new experiences and forcing yourself to go out and actually learn new things. You can learn a hobby, you can learn a skill, you can learn a craft, you can learn a language. And people brought up languages multiple times, and they were like, you should definitely learn a language, because something about the neural pathways in your brain that are created when you learn a new language and all that kind of good stuff. And I was like, okay, cool, I guess. I suck at languages, but sure. Avoid doom scrolling. And so this was really funny too, because it was always brought up in a sense of doom scrolling rots your brain. And if you doom scroll, like, you cannot do the other things. Like, there's no possible reality in which you could spend one evening doom scrolling and spend the rest of your week being really intellectual. It was like, no doom scrolling. And I was like, oh, okay. And the last one was reflect, which kind of goes in with the journaling part that they would talk about, but like having time to reflect. So taking time to yourself to be able to reflect on the things that you learned, be it what you read, what you heard, what you know, I don't know, whatever it is that you were learning, taking some time to reflect on it. And so that's that piece of like critically engaging with things, which again, I will say, no one defines what they mean by critically engaging with things or engaging critically with things. So I also found that to be interesting, because I'm like, anyways. So that's the list of what it takes to be an intellectual. So let's reverse engineer this a little bit and try to figure out what it is to be anti-intellectual, right? Because again, I want to be very clear as to why I'm doing this. And the reason is because whenever people make this type of content, they say, here's what you can do to fight the anti-intellectualism or to fight the brain rot. This is what you can do to be, without seeing it, better than everybody else who is just using their phone all the time and doom scrolling and killing their brain and becoming dumber. It's always phrased in a sense of, this is what you can do to combat this anti-intellectualism crisis. So when people term it that way, and when people are very clear that this is supposed to be the antidote to some sort of disease that's spreading right now, and the disease being anti-intellectualism, I think it makes sense that we can take what they're saying and reverse engineer it and say, look, if you're telling me that I need to do this to be an intellectual and to specifically not be anti-intellectual, I think that the opposite of this then means that I'm an anti-intellectual. So I want to make it clear as to why I decided to do this. So here's what an anti-intellectual does. They don't read books at all, or again, because it was so unclear, they don't read widely enough, or they don't read deeply enough, or they don't read and engage critically with what they're reading. So unclear again as to what this might be. They don't journal, but because journaling was dependent on reading, they don't journal about what they read. Question mark? They are closed off to learning. So I don't know if these people are actively like, don't tell me a single thing I do not know. I do not want new information in my brain. I don't know. That might be me just being mean and snarky, but it's like, I don't know if there are people out there that are literally like, I do not want to learn a single thing in my life. They also don't reflect. They don't spend time reflecting or engaging critically with things. Again, kind of vague. And they doom scroll. They just doom scroll. Guys, like, you cannot talk to people because they're just doom scrolling all the time. Point is, we've kind of created these lists, right? And specifically, we created a list of what it is to be intellectual. We created a list of what it is to be anti-intellectual. And so the idea here being that if you were anti-intellectual, then you would follow all of these things. But then the question is, if you were intellectual and you did all of these things, does that automatically make you intellectual? And that's what I was interested in too, because as I put this list together, I was like, a lot of this seems pretty vague, but a lot of this also doesn't feel like one-time thing that you do, right? You don't just like read one book and you're like, I'm an intellectual, right? So what I also thought was interesting was when you're talking about like being an intellectual, there aren't any time periods associated with this. There's no real guidelines, right? It's like, read. It's like, okay, yeah, that makes me an anti-intellectual if I read. Okay, that makes me an intellectual if I read. Interesting. I was kind of confused too, right? Because when I'm reading this list and I'm listening to what people are telling me to do to be more intellectual, I'm still confused because I don't know at what point I become an intellectual. If I read one book and I read one classical literature book, that doesn't turn me into an intellectual, right? Like, if I just read Frankenstein and I'm like, oh guys, I'm an intellectual, people can be like, no, you're not. Like, you read one book, chill. When I read 2 books, does that make me an intellectual? When I read 3 books, does that make me an intellectual? At what point do I become an intellectual? What I found really interesting too was, so people are saying that the book that you read doesn't matter. It just matters whether you engage critically with it. Okay, so if I read like Goosebumps, which I do have a whole little collection of Goosebumps books, if I read that and I like engage critically with it, I don't think people would look at me and be like, yes, she's the intellectual, like the intellectual we've been dreaming of, right? Like, no one's gonna be like, yes, you're an intellectual because you read Give Yourself Goosebumps with a critical lens. Like, that's kind of wild, right? So that doesn't really make you an intellectual. But then what you're saying is the book that I read does matter, right? So if I read, a book like, I don't know, The Odyssey, but I don't actually engage with it, I'm not an intellectual because I didn't engage with it. So it does matter the type of book that I read, but it does matter whether I engage with it or not. Even though people are kind of wishy-washy on which one matters more. Or again, no one tells you what critically engaging with a book looks like. And then there's this idea of people saying that, you should engage in like arts, right? Or you're doing crafts, or you're doing hobbies, or you're learning something. So go to art museums, go to go to musicals, go to operas or whatever. And again, I have a bit of a similar question there, because to that I would ask, if I critically engage with High School Musical, am I an intellectual? And most people would say no to that. But if I did the same with, say, the Phantom of the Opera, people would probably think I'm a bit more of an intellectual than if I said I critically engage with High School Musical 3. Again, there's this concept of what you engage with matters, but how you engage with it also matters. And this was something that I brought up in my previous video as well. But again, one of the things I'll say to this is when people talk about poetry, for example, and people say, oh, you should engage critically with poetry, and reading poetry is going to make you more intellectual, and that's great. And so if I say that I read Shakespeare's sonnets and I engage critically with it, people would think I'm an intellectual. But if I say that I do the same with something like rap, for example, conscious rap, specifically, and I say that I listen to it and I engage really critically with it, people wouldn't consider that intellectual. People would still say, well, it's rap, it's not that intellectual. Most people, not everyone, I'm not saying everyone would, but a lot of people think that, especially people who are in this realm of like intellectualism. That is where I struggle. And that's what I think has sparked a lot of these conversations for me and a lot of these thoughts for me, right? Is this idea of the line between what is considered intellectual and what isn't, or what is considered worthy of an intellectual pursuit and what isn't. So there was this really good video that I watched on YouTube by Ruby Granger, and it was titled How to Be More Intellectual, and in parentheses, drawing on Pater and Wilde. And I really enjoyed this video specifically because right at the start, she talks about how the word intellectual is problematic. And she talks about how we shouldn't be using this term intellectual, and we shouldn't be striving to be this sort of intellectual. And there's actually a lot of history behind that word. And she also talks about how there's this idea of high culture versus low culture activities when it comes to intellectualism. So she talks about things like operas and art museums and classical literature as being high culture, and that's why they're given more weight and given more value when we're talking about intellectual pursuits. And because they're high culture things, they are more worthwhile of intellectual pursuit. But you can think about things that are low culture, and those things are not considered as intellectually worthy. But similar to a lot of other videos that I watched, again, there was kind of this wishy-washy sentiment of it doesn't matter what you read, it matters how you engage in it, with, again, never quite defining what that engagement looks like. Another really good point that she made in that video was this concept of moralizing our hobbies or our pastimes or our leisure activities. As of right now, we kind of live in this world where we almost have to defend ourselves when we take on different types of hobbies or whatever we do in our leisure time. It's like we have to defend why I would want to spend time reading Goosebumps. So we've got to this point where we're moralizing what we're doing or what we're not doing, and we're saying that every waking moment that we have, be it leisure time or not, we have to spend in some sort of intellectual pursuit. And if you don't do that, you're wasting your time, and you're not, you know, like you're doing mindless, brain-rotting, brain-numbing activities. You doom scrolling on your phone is actually a direct reflection of your morals, because we've now put this weight onto what you spend your free time doing. That if you're not using your free time to educate yourself, to take back control of your life or your brain, if you're not using it to actively go out and, you know, protest or be an activist, or if you're not going out and like learning more, and you're not going out and somehow intellectualizing your free time, you're wasting it, and you're the reason that we're in a literacy crisis or something, you know? And so I think that really ties in the themes of what I'm trying to talk about here, right? Is that one, intellectualism has been taken a little bit further than it has to right now. We're not quite reflecting what it is to be an intellectual in a traditional sense. But more importantly, what I do want to talk about here too, and what I think was really helpful from Ruby Granger's video, was this idea of high culture or low culture. And what I thought was really interesting was, I think it lends to this idea of the aestheticization of intellectualism. And I don't just mean this by saying that as of right now, there's an aesthetic that's being brought about from the idea of intellectualism. This isn't a new thing. There's always been a certain type of aesthetic or a certain type of look or a certain type of feel around being an intellectual. And if you don't match that image, it's really hard for people to actually see you as an intellectual. And there's this idea of, like you have the professor, or you have the philosopher, or you have the scientist, or you have the engineer, and you have all of these people who are intellectuals, right? And they fit this image. When Ruby Granger talks about these high culture and low culture activities, that plays a huge role in what an intellectual looks like. That if you partake in high culture things, you are more likely to be seen as an intellectual than if you partake in low culture things. So if you're seen going to the opera, if you're seen reading classical literature, if you're seen wearing more attractive clothing, if you have a more socially acceptable body type, you are more likely to be seen as an intellectual. If you don't match these sort of ideas, then you don't really look like an intellectual, and you're not quite accepted as an intellectual. And that's why I think it's really, really important to be careful about the types of words that we're using when we say that we want people to engage with what they're consuming differently. When we're terming or we're clumping this entire fight against a literacy crisis, we can't just lump it all into being an intellectual, because the term intellectual carries a lot of weight with it. It really, really does paint an image of a very specific type of person who is more likely than not a white, straight man, right? Like that's the type of person that we're thinking about when we think of an intellectual. And that's why I think it's really important to keep this in mind, is that when we're talking about, being an intellectual, and we're saying that anybody can do it, and, it's open to everybody, and you just need to put time towards it. You just need to dedicate 15 minutes of your day towards being an intellectual, or you need to moralize all of your hobbies and your free time and your pastimes and your leisure time, right? You need to partake in high culture things to be able to be an intellectual. Or we're kind of turning it on its head and we're saying, no, anyone can be an intellectual. You just need to use your free time to do it. There are so many free resources. We have the internet available to us, and we can literally search up anything we want, and you can be an intellectual. You don't even have to go to university to be an intellectual. You don't have to go to college to be an intellectual. You don't need to have any type of academic background to be an intellectual, right? You can read articles. You can go to Substack. You can watch YouTube video essays like this one, and you can become an intellectual. But that's not true. That's not what being an intellectual is. And that's what I think we really, really have to keep in mind. Because when we are talking about what an intellectual looks like, at the end of the day, the things that it takes to truly become seen as an intellectual requires privilege. It really does. And it requires privilege of a lot of different types that you might not even consider privileges, right? You saying that, well, you just need 15 or 30 minutes a day to be able to devote to this study, and you can be an intellectual. So I can devote 15 minutes a day to reading, reflecting, journaling, engaging in some other sort of activity, and I can be an intellectual. Okay, well, sure, maybe that's doable. If you don't work 2 jobs a day, if you don't work multiple jobs a day, if you have a safe space to be able to do that in, if you have a home that you feel safe and comfortable in, if you have a support system, if you have a shelter, actually, let's just start there. If you have a house that you can do that in, right? If you have resources that you're able to access freely, that you can actually use, you can do that, sure. If you're in a stable state of mind, you can do that. There are all of these things that people don't quite consider privilege, but are, right? Like you're thinking about, even the 15 minutes, you can totally do it. Even that 15 minutes can be a massive ask for people who have anything going on in their lives, right? And that's what I mean when I say that a lot of these things are afforded by privilege. And again, we're talking about, some people will say, yeah, you can do it in 15 minutes. Most people won't say that. Most people say you have to dedicate your entire life to this, right? Like you really have to be able to read these things, and you have to be able to reflect on them, and then you have to be able to do research on them to be able to reflect on them and to understand them and all this kind of stuff. That it's a privilege. Time is a privilege. And again, I think it's really important to note here that a lot of times when people are talking about this sort of do-it-yourself intellectualism, that isn't actually reflective of what intellectuals truly consider themselves to be, right? This is some sort of, oh yeah, we have intellectualism at home sort of thing, sort of movement. That's not actually the way that most intellectuals are created. You don't just do it at home through free courses in your spare time. A lot of times when you are an intellectual and you have actual power to, say, make policy changes or to be able to influence those types of decisions, you need to have some sort of academic backing to prove that you're worthy of the power that comes with being able to impact these sorts of decisions, right? If you're a climate change expert, you need to have degrees to back up why you can be an expert in this field. That's what I mean when I say that there's this idea of like intellectualism that we're promoting online that isn't actually intellectualism. Like, it doesn't lead to the end goal of becoming an intellectual in the sense of being able to have power to make an impact in terms of political decisions or government decisions. And I think what's really interesting here too is we're not really reclaiming something either, right? And again, I think I'm kind of jumping the gun here because I do want to talk a little bit about how post-secondary education is very exclusionary, but it's not like we're reclaiming something, right? It's not like we're saying, oh, people used to use the word queer as a slur and now we've reclaimed it. But we're not out here reclaiming education. We're not out here reclaiming post-secondary education. One, because that can't really be done. The reason that it exists in such a way is because it's such a respected institution that there's no way to truly reclaim education in that sort of sense for communities that have historically and still do continue to be discriminated against by that system. It's really hard to dismantle the importance that comes from post-secondary education, and you will see that like it is literally so hard that it almost feels impossible to be able to dismantle the sort of grasp that post-secondary education has on our lives and on our understanding and our worldview. It is really hard to separate valuable knowledge from education and post-secondary education specifically. And you'll see that in the ways of, for example, to be a psychologist, you have to have a doctorate. It is so intertwined that you cannot separate valued information and expertise information from education. The only way that you can become an expert in your field is if you go to university for it. It is not even like this intellectualism movement is taking back what has been and still is very unaccessible for a ton of different communities, because regardless of how much self-education you do, you will never be able to be an expert in your field unless you have degrees from educational institutes to back you up. You cannot reclaim this in the way that it may seem like we're trying to do right now with intellectualism. And so this is what I mean when I say that I really struggle with the word intellectualism or becoming an intellectual. And why I struggle with it is the way that people are understanding intellectualism or leading an intellectual life isn't reflective of what it actually is to be an intellectual. Because when we talk about intellectual in the word itself, it is to have a certain level of education. It is to have a certain level of intellect, of being able to use that intellectual part of your brain. So that reasoning part of your brain, that logical part of your brain, that critical thinking part of your brain that is separate from emotion, or that is unclouded by judgment or by your own personal views. Intellect is seen as something superior to emotions. There is a certain coldness to being an intellect, to prizing your intellectualism over your emotional intelligence. When we talk about what it is to be an intellect, we talk about having academic degrees or academic knowledge to back up your intellect. We are talking about having a certain level of education or a certain level of knowledge that other people are not privy to because you have been trained to understand these sorts of things. When we're talking about becoming an intellectual, for example, you think about a philosopher like Socrates or something. You don't just become Socrates overnight. You don't just read a couple of books by Socrates and then you have the same level of thinking that he does. You need to be trained to be able to understand all of the layers that comes with critical thinking, especially when it comes to thinking in, say, a philosophical style, right? Like, it takes time to build up that skill, to hone that skill, and to train in that skill. And to be able to truly train in that, and to be able to truly have the types of conversations that you think you're having when you're an intellectual, it means you go to university to do that. You go to college to do that. It is not always possible for you to pick up that information through your free courses or through books that are widely available or through the articles that you find on Google Scholar. Having this curriculum that you've created yourself isn't the same as going to university or going to an educational institute where you have people around you that are studying the same thing. You have professors who are trained in this and have been doing this for years. You have people that are conducting research in these areas, and you have people that are considered experts in their field, imparting their knowledge and their information and their tactics onto you so that you're able to use that. If I didn't go to university, I would not be able to understand how to search for, how to look up, how to read, how to understand academic papers. There is no way in hell I could have read any academic journals if I never went to a university. And that's what I mean, is that is a skill that you learn from university. That is a skill that you are learning from some sort of higher education. And I truly do not think that I would have been able to understand that if I took a YouTube course on how to read journal articles. Having been in an academic setting and now being out of an academic setting, it's really easy for me to see the difference in the level of information that you are privy to when you are in an academic institution and when you're outside one. And what I mean by that is, when you have access to things like Google Scholar, for example, it is not the same level of information that you have access to when you are in a university. Most, like I would say 90, maybe higher % of academic information is locked behind paywalls. If you are not in an institution, you will not have access to most of the best literature in your field. Google Scholar is nothing. It scratches the surface. Like, I realized that after trying to do research for my nostalgia marketing video, and I was like, oh my god. This is so annoying. Like, I was literally sitting there trying to go through Google Scholar and pick out good articles, and almost every single one I picked out that I was like, that is going to give me the information I need, locked behind a paywall. Locked behind a paywall. All of the free ones they're good, they're great, but you're missing out on a ton of information. And that's what I mean when I say that there is it's such a difference in terms of the education or the information that you have access to when you're in an educational institute and when you're not. When I was in university, I had access to obviously tons and tons and tons of research websites. And the sort of information that you get from that is so rich that, again, if you're not in university, you don't actually have access to that. Because I went to school for psychology and I ended up doing a research intensive specialization, there was so much that I learned over those 4 years that I was there that eventually I was able to get to the point where I could read these articles and I could understand everything that they were saying, specifically in psychology. And what I mean by that is, when you're reading these articles, if you do not understand what it is to be conducting that sort of research, there's a lot that you miss out on in psychology. There are so many different statistics that you use, all these calculations that you're doing to understand whether something is actually statistically significant significant or not. And when you're reading articles about research, you're getting a very simplified version of that research, but you also tend to get information that isn't quite as accurate as the actual paper itself. So a lot of times you can have people that pick out what they want you to know without giving you all the context. So a lot of times when you're not actually reading the journal article itself, you might not be getting the full picture. People talk about this, right? And you talk about media literacy, and you talk about being able to understand what it is to have skin in the game. What I'm stressing on is that university creates barriers so that people who don't go to university cannot understand these types of things. That is the whole point of it. It is not that hard to write an academic journal article in simple language. There is a reason that they do not write it in simple language. There is a reason that they use a ton of jargon. There is a reason that it is so hard to read academic articles. There is a reason that these things are hard to understand. And the reason is they're trying to keep people out of the in circle that gets to understand this information and this research and the consequences of this research. And so when we're talking about this idea of intellectualism and being an intellectual, you cannot separate it from the value of education. And if you're talking about everybody can be an intellectual, that's just not true. That's not true. Not everyone can be an intellectual in the way that is valued in our society. Because again, me being a jack of all trades and me having a little information that I've learned from a bunch of different free articles that I found on Google Scholar isn't making me an intellectual. When I go and I talk to someone who has their doctorate in psychology, it is a very different conversation, right? Not even just doctors, someone who has their master's in psychology. It is a completely different conversation because there is so much more information that they have access to after a few more years of study than I did, right? That's what I mean when I say that you're saying, oh, everybody can be an intellectual. You have a DIY intellectual. Oh, we have intellectualism at home. No, you don't. You don't, because when you actually take this information into the real world and you're like, oh yeah, I can match someone who's gone to university and I can tell them that I have the same exact information that they do, they're gonna scoff at you. They're gonna ridicule you. No, you don't. You don't have the same level of information. And again, I am not saying this to be mean. I am not saying this to be like, haha, sucker, you're never gonna be as smart as everybody else. What I am saying is, we should not be saying that everyone can be an intellectual, because being an intellectual is meant for the privileged. Being an intellectual is meant to be something that makes you elite. It is meant to be something that sets you apart from the rest of normal people who don't have access to that sort of education. And that's what I mean when I say that we are using exclusionary terms to describe something that isn't actually this tussle between intellectualism and anti-intellectualism. You cannot become an intellectual by virtue of reading Substack articles, which, by the way, it's a whole other thing. Don't even get me into Substack. We cannot tell people that you can be something that has been designed to keep you outside. I cannot go and tell people that, like, yeah, you can be an intellectual, just do some reading, you'll be great. Like, yeah, just reflect, like, just critically engage with what you're reading, and you'll be just as good as someone who has a doctorate in something, and you're fine, and you can be just as smart, and actually everyone can be just as smart. No, there's a reason why they have very selective criteria when you're trying to apply for universities or for colleges. There's a reason why not everyone goes to post-secondary education. And there's a reason why it's mostly white people. I should say it's mostly white people in Europe and North America, right? Obviously. So the point that I want to make here is that higher education is exclusionary. And that could be based on finances. You just might not be able to afford higher education. You might not have the citizenship to be able to go to a reputable institution. You might not have the language skills to be able to attend a reputable university or educational institute. There are a ton of things that keep people out. There are also differences in ideologies that keep people out, or differences in what it is to be a scientist or an academic of some sort, right? There are differences in what it is to be that across different cultures and across different backgrounds. And there are ideas of what it is to be ready enough to go into higher education, right? So when you go to a school that doesn't quite prepare you for higher education in the way that private education might, or the way that a school in a richer area might be able to, that impacts the way that you can survive once you get into higher education. So once you get into university and college, it doesn't just end there. You don't just get in and then everything's a great ride. If you have a disability and you get into university and you get into college, if you're not able to maintain either the grades that you need, but if you're not able to maintain the course load that you need, you're not able to complete your degree in the same time that it takes everybody else to complete a degree, you could drop out. It leads to imposter syndrome. It leads to a lot of very uncomfortable feelings. And I've seen that firsthand from my time at university. I had to do an extra term in university, and I did one over the summer because I dropped my course load down because I couldn't fathom doing a full course load after I had one term of not doing a full course load. What I'm getting at here is that these institutions are not made to be welcoming to non-white people. These institutions are not made to be welcoming to people who aren't rich, who haven't had parents or family members that haven't been to university or college before. These institutions are built to continue to raise up people who already have privilege. If you have gotten to this point where you are super ready for university and you are in this, you're in this educational institute and you're doing great and you're doing amazing, you probably went to a privately funded school, or you went to a really, really good school that was in a really good area because it had the sort of resources that a lot of public schools don't have, especially public schools in areas that people or the government does not consider worthy of maintaining and bettering, right? That's the difference. Right? So you're already coming from a point of privilege to be able to succeed in university. If you do not come from a privileged background, it is a lot harder to succeed and to stay in university. That is what it takes to be an intellectual. That's what I'm trying to get at here, right? Is that you need privilege to become an intellectual, to stay an intellectual, to prove that you are an intellectual. And if you do not have these privileges, it becomes so magnitudinally harder for you to stay and to prove your worth and to be an intellectual. And so there is this idea of the intellectual and the idea and this aestheticization and the image of an intellectual being a privileged person, right? If you do not hold that privilege, you do not hold a space as an intellectual. So when we are saying, oh, you can be an intellectual too, we are not understanding the sort of context that comes with the word intellectual. We're not understanding that this concept was designed to continue to afford more privileges to people who are already privileged while shunning people who don't have privilege, who don't see themselves in these sorts of institutions or these sorts of spaces. So when we're saying you can be an intellectual, everyone should be an intellectual, we should really strive to be intellectual, otherwise you are anti-intellectual, we're not understanding that there is a ton of weight that comes with saying that. That when we're saying that you can be an intellectual too, and we're pointing at a black person, or we're pointing at an indigenous person, or a person of color, and we're saying that you can be an intellectual too, it's up to you. You're not understanding that this concept of being an intellectual has been designed to keep them out of it. You're not fully understanding that to be an intellectual is a privilege, and to say that everyone can be an intellectual is tone deaf. You're not understanding that. Anyways, I've talked a lot about the concept of an intellectual and the concept of being an intellectual, but also it's tone deaf to say that everyone can be an intellectual without quite understanding the weight that that holds, and without quite understanding that for centuries and currently people are still being kept out of these institutions, right? People are still being kept away from the sort of knowledge that makes you an intellectual. And so to say that all you need to do to be an intellectual is to read some stuff and to engage with some stuff and voila, you're an intellectual, it's not quite understanding that it's a lot more complex than that. It is inherently an exclusionary, discriminatory concept. It is something that is rooted in colonialization. It is something that is rooted in the idea that only people who are worthy of it should have access to education. And again, you can see this through paywalls, right? You can see this through how, in order to get access to academic information, you need to be in an academic institution. So if you are a general person who doesn't go to university, doesn't go to college, you do not have access to that sort of information. It is intentionally kept away from the public, intentionally. And even when it is given to the public, it is given in a way that is very hard to understand, because you do not have the sort of knowledge and background information that you need to be able to understand and decode these articles and this information and these statistics and what it really means and what they're really trying to say. And so all of this comes into this concept of intellectualism is actually actively kept away from the general public. And it is something that you have to be able to access certain spaces to be able to have the privilege to be an intellectual, right? It isn't something that everybody can do, and it isn't something that's as easily accessible as people are talking about. And the reason that I'm harping on a lot about this is because, again, we're talking about this idea of, oh, everyone can be more intellectual. I don't think intellectualism is what we're talking about. And again, we're talking about this concept of, intellectualism to fight the rise in anti-intellectualism. And now what I want to really do is, to kind of wrap this up, is actually look at what anti-intellectualism is and try to understand that this movement and these words that we're co-opting to say is, oh my God, everyone's becoming anti-intellectual. It's actually not. It's not anti-intellectualism, because that is a completely different ideology, and it's something that's very intentional, right? Like, you have to very intentionally be anti-intellectual. You do not become anti-intellectual by virtue of not being an intellectual. It's not that you exist on either sides of these, of this line, and if you're not actively on one side, you're actively on the other side. That's not how it works. Just because you're not an intellectual doesn't mean you're anti-intellectual. And I also want to talk a little bit about how, when we're talking about anti-intellectualism, I think people are missing context around what might seem like anti-intellectualism, but is actually mistrust and is actually the product of centuries of abuse, of colonization, of exclusion, right? Of discrimination. And it's not anti-intellectualism in a very clear-cut sense, right? That there is a lot more to that, and there's a lot more emotion and a lot more history behind that. That's what I'm going to talk about as I'm wrapping this up. Anti-intellectualism as a movement is not as simple as not reading enough books, or not critically engaging with books, or not critically engaging with media, or doom scrolling, or whatever it is. It's not. That list that we went over, that's not anti-intellectualism at all. That is, I don't know, that's something completely different. I don't know what the term is for it, right? Like, that is our current dependency on social media. And that has been happening for quite a few years now, right? But that isn't anti-intellectualism. No, that's not anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is an active disregard or mistrust of academics. It is actively ignoring what they say or distrusting what they say because you don't have access to that information. It is saying that, oh, that climate expert said that the world is going to end in so many years or whatever it is. I don't trust that person because that just doesn't feel right to me. Like, I don't know. Like, my garden's thriving and I don't see how that's climate change. Like, I don't know. I'm doing pretty well in my house. So actually, I don't think climate change exists because it doesn't affect me. So it can't exist, right? That's anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is an active action, right, that you're taking towards intellectualism or experts. It's actively taking this stance of, I don't care what professionals say. It doesn't align with my worldview, and so it cannot be true. If this does not reflect my reality, it cannot be true. Anti-intellectualism has been used by many, many, many leaders to quash rebellion. You can see it in so many different ways, present and past, right? But you can see people and you can see governments and leaders, specifically dictators, right, who will make decisions to rid their country of the intellectual class, because intellectuals are the people who like we've established, have access to knowledge that most people don't. And so when you get rid of that intellectual class that is able to think for themselves, or that is able to rise above the sort of campaigns that bring really horrible leaders into power, those people become dangerous, right, to these leaders. In order to prevent the loss of their seat of power, they will get rid of the people who have the power to convince other people that having someone like Stalin in charge is a bad idea. He literally went and just killed everyone who was considered an intellectual or intelligent, right? That's anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is using this idea of the sort of benefits that intellectualism can bring to a society and saying that actually that's really dangerous, because then it means that you are more susceptible to thoughts that are impure or that take you away from what's actually happening in the world, right? And there can also be a sense of seeing intellectuals as elitist, right? As saying that, well, they're so far removed from the normal person, from the common person, from the person who has to work day in and day out to be able to make ends meet. And then you have these intellectuals sitting on their little high horse being like, ooh, I can make decisions about climate change, right? And then saying that, well, we can't listen to these people because what the hell do they know about being a farmer? Like, how could these people know what it is to live on the land? And because of that, they are so wrong and they are so far removed, and there's no way that they have information that is more valuable than the information that I have. That is anti-intellectualism. Agreed, because you're making the decision to ignore what these people are saying, that you cannot have any sort of nuance in these conversations that say that, hey, this person can be right and I can be right, and there might be some space in between where we're miscommunicating or we're missing each other entirely, right? No, anti-intellectualism is taking that stance and saying 100% intellectuals are idiots, right? They don't know what they're talking about. They're only book smart. They are not street smart. There is this idea of using anti-intellectualism as a way to suppress political dissent. You have people and you have leaders that will say, we are going to get rid of everyone who is an intellectual because then there's no one left to riot, because I can easily influence people who are not intellectuals into believing that I'm actually coming in here to do good. And I've obviously seen that in history. We're obviously seeing that right now in the US. I saw that in India when Modi came into power, which, if you're not familiar with politics of India, Narendra Modi, who is still in power, his party, the BJP, is very similar to Trump. And it was kind of around the same time that the two of them came into power. And this is the first time that Trump came into power. So it was like 2016, I think it was around that time. Modi did something very similar, right? Like his entire platform was built on the fact that he wasn't an intellectual, that he was a hardworking man who, was like, he is here for the common man. He is here to advocate for the common man. That's what ends up happening, right? It's like people use this idea of down with the intellectual. I'm anti-intellectual and I'm unintellectual, but I am still worth it. That is anti-intellectual, right? Being anti-intellectual and being kinda doubtful about intellectualism are two different things. And it's a very, very fine line. The reason that I'm trying to make this distinction here too is because I think that there are different ways that this can show up, right? And so again, you have this idea of anti-intellectualism being something that is very malicious. It's very intentional. It's very strategic from a leadership point of view, from a normal day-to-day living kind of style. It is unwilling to accept that there are multiple realities and that there are different experiences, and that just because you're not being affected by something that the rest of the world is being affected by doesn't mean that it isn't real and it isn't true. But if you question intellectuals, that doesn't automatically make you anti-intellectual. You say you have this finding, you've done this research, can I ask who you researched on? And they say, oh, we researched on white men aged 20 to 40, living in a pretty wealthy neighborhood. And I say, well, is that really applicable research? Is that research that genuinely reflects most of the population of the Earth, or most of the population of North America? Does that accurately represent the sort of experiences that people might have, like a day-to-day, everyday person? Is that something that's actually going to reflect the sort of experience that they have? To that, the answer is no. When there's that sort of study, and I say, I don't trust that study because it's not applicable to me. What I'm saying is, I don't trust that study because it actually isn't applicable to most people. That is only applicable to a very select population that is middle-aged white men from wealthy neighborhoods. That doesn't reflect the general population of Canada. Right? Or of America, or of anywhere in the world, really. That is not the general population, right? So that questioning is more a questioning of, have you really thought through the impact of your research? Have you really thought through whether your research accurately represents the type of information that you're trying to tell people it does? Taking a study that focuses on a very small group of people and then saying that it suddenly applies to the entire population, that's inaccurate science. That is not good intellectualism. And that's what I'm trying to say here, is that a lot of times we conflate this idea of anti-intellectualism with conflict or with questioning the validity of certain research, even though a lot of times it's very valid questioning. And what I want to say here is that when you talk to someone who says, well, I don't really know if I trust that research, ask them why. Don't just assume that they're anti-intellectual. Ask them, why don't you trust that research? And then if their answer is, well, that research has actually been known to exploit Indigenous communities, that's pretty bad. And that's an example of when it makes perfect sense to question these things. When we talk about certain communities that have been historically and still are excluded from either the sort of research that intellectuals are doing or from being an intellectual themselves, it totally makes sense that they seem to be mistrusting of intellectuals, but really they're mistrusting of the system itself, right? If you talk to a lot of Indigenous people, they will say, oh, we hate researchers. Like, we don't want them in our homes. We don't want them in our areas. And a lot of times when you speak to Indigenous nations about this, they'll say, historically, they've come in here, they've done research, they haven't spoken to a single one of us, and then they go and they publish these papers. And then people look at them as the experts of our own homelands, of the areas that we literally still live on right now. Like, they will literally come to our houses and they will do this research. And they'd be like, ha, I am now an expert in this specific field. And they don't care about what Indigenous people have to say. They don't care about their experiences. They don't care about the wealth of knowledge that they have. They only care about their scientific research that matches and fits within the parameters of what Western education has told them counts as research. And so when we're talking about things like, who mistrusts intellectuals? And then we look at, say, Indigenous peoples, or we look at Black people, or we look at racialized people, and we say, well, you guys have to be anti-intellectual because you don't trust these institutions and you don't trust these researchers, so you must be anti-intellectual. No, take a step back, ask questions, understand why or where this stems from and where this comes from, right? A lot of times it's from exclusion. It's from how you've been treated by these institutions all the way up until literally right now, right? It's like when you're discriminated against constantly, how can you look favorably at these institutions that are the ones that are continuing this legacy of discrimination, that are still doing it to this day, right? Like, how could you possibly trust people who continue to discriminate against you, who continue to have racist worldviews, that continue to have exclusionary and privileged worldviews? These are the questions that you should be asking, right? That you should try to understand more. And so again, what this all comes down to at the end of the day is that this idea of intellectualism versus anti-intellectualism is a much more loaded conversation. It is a much larger conversation, and it is not something that actually accurately reflects what's happening right now online in social media. When we're talking about anti-intellectualism, reading Fourth Wing isn't anti-intellectual. No, it's not anti-intellectual. Reading A Court of Thorns and Roses isn't anti-intellectual. It's not the best literature out there, sure, but is it anti-intellectual? Not really. Saying that you're anti-vax is probably a little bit more anti-intellectual, right? Saying that you don't trust climate experts is a little bit more anti-intellectual. Saying that you think Trump is still a good president is anti-intellectual. But questioning the validity of research that was designed to be exclusive isn't anti-intellectual. There's so much more to this conversation, and there's so much more to specifically the concepts of intellectualism and anti-intellectualism, that when we co-opt these terms and we use them for something that is absolutely unrelated, we end up with this scare, right? Like there's this scare of, oh my god, if I read a book that isn't as engaging as the Odyssey, I'm being anti-intellectualist. When I do not spend every waking moment trying to learn a new language, I am becoming anti-intellectual. There's this worry, there's this scare, there's this fear-mongering of if you do not actively try to be intellectual, you are by default becoming anti-intellectual. But that is not true. There is a very intentional mindset shift that needs to happen for you to become anti-intellectual. It has to be a shift in your beliefs, in how you truly view the world, in what you trust and what you don't trust, and what you value and what you don't value. There has to be a very, very intentional shift to this. And for that reason, anti-intellectualism and intellectualism and, the concept of the right versus the left can be linked. You have this idea of intellectualism being more left-leaning and anti-intellectualism being more right-leaning. When we're trying to understand it in a political, specifically a US political viewpoint. Not a lot of people have very clear-cut right and left sides in the way that the US does. That's what I'm trying to say, is that it has to be very intentional. It isn't something that happens on accident. There are pipelines that get you from, being sort of maybe in the middle to actively being anti-intellectual. But it isn't something that just happens because you read A Court of Thorns and Roses. Like, that isn't just a natural progression of the world. That if you read Fourth Wing, you are automatically anti-intellectual, and there's no way to stop that from happening. That's not true. It's not true, and that's not accurate at all, right? And you spending a little bit more time on social media than you should isn't automatically going to make you anti-intellectual. Doom scrolling isn't going to automatically make you anti-intellectual. It can be a pipeline, right? Doom scrolling or not spending as much time, say, reflecting on what you're reading or whatever it is, or consuming media that is, that contains dog whistles and stuff like that. Yes, that could lead to becoming anti-intellectual, but simply doing things that are termed anti-intellectual by this weird little thing that's happening online right now, it doesn't actually make you anti-intellectual, right? It has to be a very intentional thing. And so the point of this conversation, and to kind of close out this really wild, basically rant session for me, the point is that I don't believe, if it isn't clear already, I don't believe that we're using the right terms to explain what's happening right here. I don't think that intellectualism and anti-intellectualism is accurate for what we're experiencing right now. And I agree that, there are things that could lead to somebody becoming anti-intellectual. I agree. I think there are many ways for that to happen. I don't think that reading is the only way for that to happen. I don't think that reading smut is the only way for that to happen. But I do understand that reading books like ACOTAR that do have underlying themes of racism can lead to reading more of these books without truly understanding how it affects your worldview, and then eventually getting to this point where you've listened to all of these dog whistles and you are now at the point at which you're anti-intellectual, right? It's very similar to all these pipelines to the alt-right, right? Like how you have this like trad wife to alt-right pipeline, right? You have this crunchy granola mom or whatever pipeline to like alt-right, right? You have these things that can lead to you becoming pretty far right, or you can have these things that can lead to you becoming anti-intellectual. But what we're seeing right now isn't quite anti-intellectualism, especially with the way people are defining it and the way people are talking about it. I just don't think that that's accurate. And if we're talking about these things, we should be saying that, hey, you could be at risk for maybe becoming easier to influence if you aren't quite keeping up with your critical thinking skills. What we're doing when we have these conversations, what becomes harmful, is that people aren't quite realizing what this means, right? And so a lot of times when you're having these conversations and you're saying, oh my god, reading Fourth Wing is anti-intellectual, you just have people defending themselves. And I talked about this in my previous video too. When you go on the attack in that sort of way, people become defensive about things, right? It's natural. It's natural to want to defend yourself. It's an instinct to want to defend yourself. And so when people are saying things like, wow, you're stupid when you read Fourth Wing, people aren't going to want to have a conversation with you. People are going to be like, actually, you're an idiot and intellectuals are suck. And you're not realizing that when you're not taking the sort of care and the sort of understanding and the sort of empathy that it takes to have these conversations, the sort of humility it takes to have these conversations, you're actually pushing people further down this pipeline because you're pushing people further down into questioning or disbelieving or mistrusting intellectuals or the concept or anything that comes from intellectualism, right? You're telling people that intellectuals attack you, intellectuals think you're stupid, intellectuals don't have space to have conversations with you about these things. And so you're pushing them further into this idea of, I don't trust these people because they don't value me as a person and they just see me as an idiot. And so you're pushing them further down this line and down this route to get to the point where they can be influenced into actually becoming anti-intellectual. What I'm trying to say at the end of this video is, on social media, people can be very polarizing, right? It's very much like you have to choose one side. And if you're not on one side, you're automatically on the other side. You have people not really having the space to have these conversations because a lot of platforms like YouTube and TikTok and just social media in general, it prizes shock value over having good conversations, right? You want to have something that makes people want to click this sort of content. You need to have some sort of clickbait, rage bait, or some sort of shock value that goes into what you're creating because there's so much content that you need to have something that hooks people in and that makes them want to watch your video more than any other video. But I think what happens is that in that, we're losing the ability to have these nuanced conversations. And what happens is when people are spending so much of their time on social media, you start having those sorts of conversations in real life. And then it's really hard to be able to create space to have these conversations because you're so used to being on social media and you're so used to seeing these very polarizing opinions and these polarizing discussions where everything's an argument, everything's either cancelled or not, and everything is you're on one side or you're on the other side and you're either on the right side or you're on the wrong side and there's no in between and there's no nuance and there's no room to have conversations to be able to either educate people or to get educated or to understand why people think the way that they do. And because you can't have these conversations online and you're not seeing examples of these conversations being had online, it becomes really hard to have these conversations in real life. So when you're actually talking to people in real life and you come across people who are like, oh yeah, I love Fourth Wing, you're instinctively like, wow, she's dumb. Like, oh my god, like this person reads Fourth Wing, they're so anti-intellectual. And you can't have a conversation with them because you don't know how to have a conversation with them around these things because no one's having it or no one's putting that on social media, right? So what I want to say, or what I think I want to end this on, is hold space for different realities. Hold space for different experiences. When you're talking to people and someone has a different opinion from you, take a bit of a second to understand where they're coming from before you write them off in your head. I'm not saying that, okay, you need to afford every person the same type of kindness, but I just don't think that we're doing it at all these days, right? I've been in some really frustrating conversations with people where I've just been like, you know what, I don't think I have it in me to be able to talk to you about this anymore. And so there comes a point at which you can say, you know what, I actually don't think I can talk to you about this anymore. If it's something you're interested in learning, go and do your research. It's just not something I can talk to you about anymore. But I try to lead with empathy in these conversations if I'm having them with someone for the first time. When I'm talking to someone for the first time and they're saying, you know, oh my god, well, it's actually so anti-intellectual to do this stuff, I'd be like, well, why do you think so? Like, let's actually have a conversation before I just write you off as someone that I can't have a conversation with, or someone that will never get me, or someone that'll never change their mind. Let me talk to you about it. Let me understand why. I absolutely want to note that this is, you know, this doesn't have to be for everyone, and it really does depend on where you are in your life. But I do think that it's worth building up that muscle to be able to do that. And I think it does take a lot to be able to do that, and it's not easy. But I just think that if that space has never been afforded to someone to be able to have that conversation, to be able to explain themselves, to be able to understand things from different point of views, and to just have kindness while we're talking about things that are so polarizing, I don't understand how we expect them to change or how we expect them to understand where other people are coming from. Give people a little bit of space to explain themselves and then decide how you want to move forward with the conversation. Don't just assume that you already know every single thing about them and where they're coming from. Have a little bit more kindness. And I think the whole world could benefit from that right now, because we truly are living in an era where everything is clickbait, is shock value, is polarizing, and is either right or wrong, or left or right, or conservative or liberal. Let's have some of these nuanced conversations. Let's have them with a little bit of kindness, and let's try to understand where people are coming from before we lay our own stereotypes and prejudices on them. Thanks for coming on this wild ride with me, guys. If you like this video, please give it a like. I want to know that you did so that I'll keep making content like this. Hit that subscribe button too so you get all of this content when it's done. And let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you agree with me, if you don't. But again, let's keep some kindness in this world, guys. I will definitely see you soon, because I'm gonna be making more videos on anti-intellectualism. Anyways, see ya.